Ever stopped and thought about what truly sets us apart from everything else out there? Like what makes us, well, human? It's a question that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries.
It really is a big one. I mean, where do we fit into the whole grand scheme of things? It's fascinating how the work of a single person could completely change our understanding of that question. And that person, of course, is Charles Darwin.
Yeah, Darwin, the name everyone recognizes. And for good reason. For centuries, people relied on philosophical and religious views to explain their existence and how they connected to the natural world.
Right, exactly. But Darwin's theories, especially those laid out on the origin of species and later in the descent of man, they went beyond just scientific observation. They challenged those existing philosophical ideas about life, our place in it, even about morality.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're really going to explore how Darwin, through his meticulous research and groundbreaking ideas, basically acted as a philosopher himself.
Absolutely. And we'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Darwin, From the Origin of Species to the Descent of Man. It's a really comprehensive resource that breaks down the historical and philosophical context surrounding Darwin's work and its huge impact.
Perfect. So our goal here is to uncover those core philosophical shifts that Darwin's theories triggered.
Yeah, it's not about simply rehashing Darwin's scientific discoveries. I mean, those have been widely documented and discussed. We want to go deeper to see how his ideas shook up existing worldviews and transformed our understanding of life, ourselves, and even our ethical obligations.
So before Darwin came along and kind of turned everything upside down, what were the prevailing ideas about the natural world and humanity's role in it all?
Well, in Britain, where Darwin was working, the dominant viewpoint was heavily shaped by natural theology.
Natural theology,
Yeah,
okay.
so think of someone like William Paley.
Okay,
He's known for that famous analogy of finding a watch,
right.
and using it to argue that because of its intricate design, there must have been a divine watchmaker.
So the idea that complex design implies a designer.
Exactly. And in this view, the intricate organization of living beings was seen as irrefutable evidence for an intelligent creator.
Okay.
And along with that came the belief in the fixity of species, the idea that each species was created in its present form and remained unchanged over time.
So no change, everything fixed as it is.
Right. And this concept of essentialism, where each species has these unchanging essential characteristics, was like a cornerstone of biological thought back then.
So the prevailing thought was of this perfectly designed, unchanging world with humans, naturally, placed right at the top.
Exactly. But you have to remember that evolutionary ideas weren't completely new when Darwin came along. There were thinkers before him who had proposed the idea of species transformation, although their ideas about how it happened and how far-reaching it was, they varied quite a bit.
Okay.
What really set Darwin apart, and this is something the Stanford entry emphasizes, was his approach, his methodology. He was heavily influenced by thinkers like John Herschel and William Whewell. Herschel, he stressed the importance of vera causa.
Vera causa meaning.
It means true causes, causes that you could actually demonstrate empirically to produce the effects you observe.
Okay, so provable causes.
Right. And then Whewell, he highlighted the consilience of inductions, where a strong scientific theory could bring together seemingly unrelated phenomena under one explanatory framework.
Oh, I see. So tying things together with a consistent explanation.
Exactly. And Darwin's philosophical aim was to establish those true causes, like natural selection, as explanations for the origin of species and to achieve that unified understanding.
So he wasn't just presenting a new idea, he was trying to build a rock-solid scientific argument based on the accepted standards of his time. That's pretty impressive. The Stanford entry also points out that Darwin's initial focus was really specific, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's crucial for understanding his work. Unlike some earlier evolutionary theories that tried to explain everything, the origin of the universe, the origin of life itself, Darwin's origin of species, had a more limited scope. It specifically focused on the transformation of species through natural processes.
Okay.
The entry contrasts this with Robert Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation,
Right.
which, while it was a popular book, presented a much broader but less scientifically rigorous view of evolution on both a cosmic and biological scale. Darwin, he steered clear of those grander cosmological questions in his initial work, focusing on the more immediate, testable question of how species change.
So he really honed in on the nuts and bolts of how species evolve over time rather than trying to tackle the ultimate origin of everything. Now, something I found super interesting in the entry was how Darwin initially used the analogy of nature acting almost like a conscious agent. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, this is where things get really fascinating because we see Darwin wrestling with how to conceptualize and communicate this brand new mechanism of natural selection.
Right.
So, in his early drafts, he leaned heavily on the analogy between artificial selection. You know how humans breed plants and animals for specific traits in natural selection. He even portrayed nature as this selective force, almost like a wise being with foresight, acting over vast stretches of time to favor certain characteristics.
Wow. That almost makes it sound like he was personifying nature, giving it intentions and goals.
You're right. He did use that kind of anthropomorphic language in the early stages, and it was a powerful way to explain the selective aspect of natural selection to his initial readers.
I can see how that would be helpful.
But it also drew criticism. Philosophically, it seemed to suggest a teleological view, the idea that nature was working towards specific ends, almost as if there was a divine plan unfolding through natural processes.
Oh, I see. That's definitely a tricky area to navigate.
It was. And as the Stanford entry points out, Darwin later moved away from this more intentional language in the published version of Origin, probably because of those concerns about teleology and the potential for his theory to be misinterpreted as just another form of natural theology. He started to emphasize the more mechanistic aspects of the struggle for existence and the idea of differential survival.
That makes sense. He was really striving to explain these phenomena through natural laws, not through some conscious guiding force. Now, another big philosophical hurdle Darwin had to overcome was the prevailing idea of species essentialism. How did he tackle that one?
That was a huge shift in perspective. The traditional view, which goes all the way back to thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, held that species were fixed categories, and each one was defined by certain essential, unchanging properties.
So a lion is a lion because it has the essence of lionness.
Exactly. And these essences were considered to be immutable, never changing. But Darwin, through his extensive observations, particularly his very detailed work on barnacle taxonomy, he came to recognize that there's significant variation within species. And this blurred the lines between those clear-cut categories that essentialism depended on.
So he started to see a spectrum of traits instead of these distinct, unchanging categories.
Precisely. He focused on the continuous variation that exists among individuals within a species and how those variations could be passed down. He famously described varieties as incipient species.
Incipient species.
Meaning species in the process of forming.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. The Stanford entry highlights how Darwin's hands-on experience with barnacles, where the lines between varieties and species were often blurry, really influenced this view. He argued that species weren't these fixed entities, but rather points along a continuum of evolving forms.
That makes a lot of sense. This idea of constant variation leading to gradual change is really central to his theory, isn't it?
It is.
And it kind of naturally leads us to that concept of the struggle for existence, which, just the phrase itself, sounds quite philosophical.
It is profoundly philosophical. Darwin took Thomas Malthus's principle of population, which was initially about human populations potentially outgrowing their food supply, and he applied it to all of nature.
Wow, so he really broadened its scope.
He did. He argued that all organisms tend to reproduce exponentially, meaning they produce far more offspring than can actually survive given the available resources.
Okay.
And this inevitably leads to a struggle for existence, not just in a literal fighting for survival sense, but in a broader ecological context. Think competition for resources, avoiding predators, surviving diseases. Even a plant competing for sunlight is part of this struggle.
So it's less about a direct fight and more about a constant pressure to survive and reproduce.
Exactly. And the philosophical implication here is really important. It introduced this dynamic element into the natural world, where survival and reproduction weren't guaranteed. They depended on an organism's ability to thrive in its specific environment.
That makes sense.
It also shifted the focus away from this idea of an inherent drive towards greater complexity, which some earlier evolutionary thinkers had proposed.
Yep.
Instead, it emphasized the limits on population growth and how individuals with advantageous variations were more likely to survive and reproduce within that struggle.
So it's about adaptation to specific circumstances, not just an inherent drive towards complexity.
Exactly. The Stanford entry uses examples like the interconnectedness of red clover and Scotch fir just to show these complex ecological dimensions of the struggle for existence.
Right, so everything's connected in ways we might not even realize. Now, speaking of visual representations of ideas, that famous tree of life diagram in The Origin strikes me as a very powerful philosophical statement in itself.
Absolutely. That single diagram is so philosophically significant. It visually captures the essence of Darwin's theory:
Okay.
descent with modification, the divergence of lineages from common ancestors, and the constant reality of extinction. The branching pattern beautifully shows how new species emerge from existing ones, creating this massive, interconnected family tree of all life.
And the fact that most of those branches don't reach the top, that really highlights the ongoing process of elimination and change, doesn't it?
It does. The Stanford entry also points out the relativity of the diagram's coordinates. What I mean by that is, while Darwin initially presented it at the species level, he suggested the same branching pattern could apply to all levels of biological classification, genera, families, orders over incredibly vast periods of geological time.
So it's a pattern that repeats itself at different scales.
Exactly. It suggests a profound unity of life,
Okay.
and even hints at the possibility of a single origin for all living things, although the first edition of Origin was a bit ambiguous about whether this origin was purely naturalistic or involved some initial act of creation.
Right, so there was still some room for interpretation there.
There was, but the later addition of the phrase "by the creator" in the second edition, that reflects the philosophical and theological debates happening at the time.
It's interesting how those external pressures can influence the way scientific ideas are presented and interpreted.
For sure.
Now, Darwin's ideas, as revolutionary as they were, obviously weren't met with universal applause. What were some of the main philosophical challenges he faced?
Oh, there are many objections, and many of them really got at fundamental philosophical assumptions. One big point of contention was the idea of gradualism.
Gradualism.
Yeah, the idea that evolution happens through these slow, incremental changes. Critics question whether the fossil record actually showed the numerous intermediate forms that Darwin's theory seemed to predict.
Right, they were looking for more evidence of those gradual transitions.
Exactly. Another challenge was the complexity of certain organs, like the vertebrate eye.
That's a classic example.
It is. How could such intricate structures evolve through small, undirected steps? It seemed almost impossible to some. The entry mentions Fleming-Junkin's critique, which argued that variations would be diluted through interbreeding, so natural selection wouldn't be able to produce truly significant evolutionary change.
Okay, so a limit on how much change natural selection could actually drive.
Right. And Jenkin also raised concerns about the vast timescales that Darwin's theory required, especially given the understanding of physics at the time. It seemed like there wasn't enough time for all that change to occur.
So Darwin was facing challenges on multiple fronts.
He was, and the entry notes that he actually modified his theory somewhat in later editions of The Origin in response to some of these challenges.
So he was engaged in this ongoing back and forth, refining his ideas as new evidence and arguments emerged. It was a real intellectual battleground. Now, let's shift our focus to the descent of man. Even the title itself signals a direct engagement with philosophical questions about humanity, right?
Absolutely. While The Origin mostly avoided directly discussing human evolution, The Descent of Man tackled the issue head-on. It explored our place within the evolutionary narrative.
Okay.
Darwin argued that human mental faculties, things like intelligence and reason, were not unique or divinely bestowed. They existed on an evolutionary continuum with those of animals.
So he was challenging that idea of human exceptionalism.
He was. This directly challenged the Cartesian dualism of mind and matter, which proposed a fundamental separation between human consciousness and the physical world. The Stanford entry points out the importance of Darwin's early notebooks, where he developed this monistic view, suggesting a single underlying reality for both mind and body.
So instead of a separate mind and body, he saw them as interconnected, part of the same reality. That's a pretty big philosophical leap.
It is.
So essentially, he was saying that everything that defines us as human, our intelligence, emotions, everything has its roots in the animal kingdom.
Exactly. And he gave many examples of mental and emotional characteristics that are shared by both humans and animals.
Like what?
Things like courage, deception, playfulness, even rudimentary forms of reason and communication. He argued that these traits, just like physical characteristics, had evolved through natural and sexual selection. The entry provides a whole list of these shared properties. It's really compelling.
I'll have to check that out.
It's pretty amazing. He even extended this evolutionary perspective to religious belief,
Wow.
suggesting it arose from our imagination and a tendency to believe in unseen forces. He saw parallels of this in animal behaviors, like a dog's devotion to its owner.
So even something as deeply ingrained as religious belief could have evolutionary origins. That's a radical idea, especially for the time.
It was hugely controversial.
Now, the dissent also gets into Darwin's theory of ethics, which seems like a particularly complex philosophical area.
It definitely is. Darwin attempted to ground ethics in natural history, arguing that our sense of morality evolved from social instincts,
Okay.
and those instincts were favored by natural selection because they helped groups survive. He drew inspiration from the Scottish moral sense tradition, which emphasized innate moral feelings. However, Darwin's evolutionary twist was that these feelings weren't divinely implanted. They arose through the pressures of evolution.
So things like empathy and cooperation, they weren't gifts from some higher power, but rather developed because they gave our ancestors an advantage in surviving and thriving within social groups.
That's the heart of his argument. He proposed this tension between individual and social instincts, with natural selection ultimately favoring the social ones because they benefit the group as a whole. But the entry notes that Darwin's evolutionary ethics caused a lot of philosophical debate, especially around what's called the is-ought problem.
The is-ought problem. Okay,
Well,
break that down for us.
sure, it's the question of whether we can figure out moral obligations, what we ought to do, just by observing the natural world, what is.
All right, so is there a direct link between what is natural and what ought to be morally right?
Exactly. And critics like Huxley and G.E. Moore, they questioned the validity of evolutionary ethics. They argued it could lead to moral relativism and couldn't provide a solid basis for universal moral principles. And these debates are still going on in philosophy today.
It seems like Darwin's work really opened up this Pandora's box of philosophical questions. He wasn't just challenging our understanding of biology, but our fundamental ideas about mind, morality, even spirituality.
Yeah.
Now, how did people react to all of this? How were these groundbreaking ideas in both the origin and the descent received by the public and the scientific community at the time?
Oh, the reception was incredibly diverse.
Okay,
As the entry details, the origin sparked a huge controversy.
makes sense.
And this played out differently across various countries and cultures. You know, it really depended on the existing intellectual, religious, social, and political landscape. In English-speaking countries, it got tangled up in debates about things like slavery in the U.S. and the massive social changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And the popularity of earlier evolutionary works like Vestiges had, in a way, prepared people for the general idea of evolution, but not necessarily for Darwin's specific mechanism of natural selection. Some people even tried to reconcile Darwin's ideas with this progressive, teleological view of evolution, often drawing on the ideas of Herbert Spencer.
Oh, so they were trying to fit Darwin's theory into their existing frameworks.
Exactly. And in other parts of the world, like France, Germany, and China, the reception was shaped by their own unique intellectual traditions and social conditions. In Germany, for example, Ernst Haeckel was a big champion of Darwinism, but he viewed it as a form of scientific materialism. And he used it in political and religious debates. In China, Darwin's ideas were initially introduced through translations that were often influenced by Spencerian progressivism and Confucian thought.
So Darwin's work was being interpreted and used in all sorts of different ways, sometimes very differently from his original intentions.
Definitely. Even within the scientific community, there was a lot of division. While influential figures like Thomas Huxley became strong supporters of Darwin, many others remained skeptical, especially about his emphasis on gradualism and the fact that there wasn't a clear mechanism for how traits were inherited at the time. The entry emphasizes that accepting the idea of descent with modification didn't automatically mean accepting natural selection as the primary driving force.
So Darwinism, as it was understood back then, often differed quite a bit from Darwin's actual theory.
For sure. And the descent, with its direct implications for humanity's place in nature, probably caused even more controversy.
Yeah, it was taking things a step further, pushing into even more sensitive territory.
Absolutely. The Descent of Man presented a more radical Darwin to the public. It directly challenged traditional views on human origins and seemed to align him with materialist and anti-religious viewpoints. Even some who had been open to the origin found the implications of the descent for human nature and morality harder to swallow. There were a lot of critical reviews, especially targeting his evolutionary explanations of ethics and intellectual abilities. But despite this initial resistance, the intellectual revolution that Darwin started eventually gained widespread acceptance, even among those who had initially been critical.
So his impact, even if it wasn't always his main goal, is undeniable.
Absolutely. To kind of sum up those key philosophical shifts for you, Darwin's work challenged those long-held beliefs in fixed species and a divinely designed natural order. He offered a natural explanation for adaptation and the diversity of life through the mechanism of natural selection. He placed humans firmly within the evolutionary process, arguing for a continuity of mind and morality with the animal kingdom. And he questioned traditional teleology, presenting a view of life driven by natural laws rather than predetermined purposes.
And as the entry makes clear, understanding these historical and philosophical dimensions gives us a much richer and more nuanced appreciation of modern biology and our place in the universe. It really satisfies that craving for in-depth knowledge, doesn't it?
It does. It's pretty amazing. So, to you, our listener, as you consider this interconnectedness of all life that Darwin's work reveals, what does it mean for our understanding of our responsibility to the natural world and to each other? Darwin's exploration of the natural world continues to shape how we see ourselves. What long-held beliefs might you now reconsider in light of these evolutionary insights into our very origins in nature?
That's a lot to ponder. And if you're interested in delving even deeper into this fascinating topic, we highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Darwin. It's a fantastic resource and a great starting point for continued learning.
It is. I highly recommend it.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.